In this conversation for the Miami Corona Project, trying to address the impact of the pandemic, we're exploring the connection between this pandemic and the broader climate emergency that we're facing in this nation and how the two are interconnected, how future pandemics are going to be exacerbated by the conditions that we're creating on planet Earth, and what lessons, if any, we can learn from this pandemic so that we're better prepared at a structural level to handle this pandemic. And I can't think of a better person to talk about what is a global pandemic and a global crisis than someone who's been an advisor on international policy and law and an environmental attorney, and has spent more than 15 years in the work of negotiating and working on the behalf of developing nations. And actually, Maria, could you tell us a little bit about your work? First of all, welcome and thank you so much for being a part of this conversation.
My pleasure. Thank you, Xavier. It's really an honor to be here talking with you this morning, and thanks for giving me the opportunity. Yes, as you mentioned, I'm an international environmental lawyer, and I have been working with in different international organizations like the World Bank, the United Nations Environment Program, and the United Nations Development Program for years on different aspects of environmental issues as they relate to how governments develop their policies and implement those policies to help protect people and the environment in countries. I've also worked as an advisor for a number of developing countries on the climate negotiations and also on the Ozone Treaty and helping them negotiate those treaties and bringing the decisions from those treaties into their own national contexts. I do a lot of capacity building for countries as well. So it's been a fun ride working in those contexts.
Thank you, Ana Maria. You've actually been a personal inspiration to me in my work, and I'm
Oh,
so happy that we can take this moment to see if we can continue inspiring people through your words. You've done a lot of work on climate, on water. Tell us, just before we even say the word pandemic, just let's talk about Earth and climate and where we are today and where we are headed unless we do something about it without even mentioning the word pandemic. In a succinct way, let's talk about where we are as a planet.
okay. So, as many of your viewers and listeners know, there is a climate change crisis that the world is swiftly moving into. We've already seen a lot of the impacts of the early stages of climate change in places around the world, like the California and Australia wildfires, sea level rise, even in Florida along the coastline there and other coastlines of our own country. But then there are small vulnerable islands around the world that are also losing land, and the salt water is intruding into their islands. They're no longer able to farm as a result of that. So we're beginning to see the impacts already. There's no more doubt as to whether climate change really exists. The questions that scientists are helping us answer now is how soon, how strong, and the variety of impacts that we're going to feel in different places, because those factors change depending on how much CO2 emissions we have in the atmosphere. So the worrisome thing is that, as you know, the world is continuing to emit greenhouse gas emissions at a rate that is not sustainable. And so what the scientists have told us recently is that basically we have now less than 10 years to get on track in terms of reducing the emissions that we're currently putting into the air, but also they're telling us that we have to do more in terms of what's called carbon dioxide removal, CDR sometimes known as, which means we've got to put systems in place that pull the carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And one of the things that does that in the most beautiful way, and you've been working on for years, is the mangrove forests. So there are solutions, and I always like to talk about those. And I'm an optimist. I believe that humans are are infinitely innovative, creative, and intelligent, and that we know what we need to get done. And so what we have to do is really put those solutions in place faster and at a greater scale than we've been doing now if we want to avoid the worst impacts for people. And when we talk about climate change, oftentimes it feels very abstract, something that's happening up in the atmosphere. But really what we're talking about is our well-being and our survival as humans on this planet, because those impacts are they're threats to our lives.
And of course, threats to our lives outside of pandemics alone. You've described all those reasons. Ecosystem collapse is the collapse of human civilization. Ecosystem collapse means that pollinators and coral reefs and all the ecosystem services that we have, including the very land that we live on and depend on, it changes. And that is why there's such a sense of urgency. That's why this is an emergency. That's why we're in a crisis. That carbon that you were talking about in the atmosphere, that those particulates, that thing we call pollution, actually has an impact on lungs. It weakens lungs. So when we talk about pandemics, that is yet another way of humans suffering because of human impact, the unintended consequences of an industrial revolution that we somehow can't kick. And I just want to see if you can draw some parallels between and again, I'm glad I'm talking literally to someone who has traveled the entire planet, who has worked and trained people across. I think it's every continent on this planet, except for maybe the penguins in Antarctica. That you've literally every place where we've had human well, not every place, but you've done an incredible job in training and working with communities across the world. And I just want you to talk us through this pandemic, its global impact, our interconnectivity to one another and to the environment, and how a weakened environment, said another way, a planet that isn't as healthy can create conditions for this pandemic to spread in even worse ways in the future. And by conditions, I mean clearly the natural systems, but I also mean the processes and the structures that we create to feed one another and to engage with one another at our local, but clearly because we are now globalized, the global impact of those things. I just want to sort of paint, it sounds really obvious, but I kind of want to paint that picture and that connection for us. Could you do that?
I'll do my best. So I want to sort of first talk a little bit about how are we making this connection between the COVID pandemic and climate change. And some of the listeners, viewers may have already seen newspaper articles or heard some of our politicians talking about this connection. And it may seem a bit far-fetched. One of the things that's important to keep in mind or to understand is that COVID is not caused by climate change, right? That's not where the connection is, and nobody is saying that that's the case. But there are many similarities between the two global crises, and one of them you've pointed out, which is the advancement of globalization. We live in a world where we can order something online, and it comes to us from the opposite end of the world and gets to our households within days. We also live in a world where people are constantly on airplanes traveling around doing business or tourism. It's just very easy. We're very connected to every part of the planet through our human activities, through our consumption, our production, through our economies, through our friendships, and our even our hobbies. And what a globalized world like that means is lots of opportunities, but there are also additional risks to doing that. And the reason why COVID has spread so quickly and around the world is because of the same, some of these same things that also lead to climate change. A lot of airplane traffic, a lot of travel around places, and also, as you've pointed out, the level of human development, our civilizations are so big now that oftentimes we take for granted taking care of the environment that we depend on and that protects us. And so the COVID virus comes to us, as we've been told by scientists, from a market in Wuhan where people were consuming animal products in a way that triggered a virus. And climate change comes from a wide variety of activities that are also beyond what is a healthy level in terms of maintaining a balance in the world for how for what we need in order to survive in a healthy way.
Right. So the deforestation, the encroachment upon wilderness, the destruction of habitat for animals that make animals come into contact with humans in the way that would have otherwise not happened is one of the reasons we see time and time again that animal to human transmission. So deforestation, encroachment, having um, that kind of impact on wilderness in a world that has a population that is quickly approaching 8 billion, where deforestation happens so that monocultures could replace beautiful, pristine forests that are in and of themselves, protecting and regulating themselves. Those disappears. The animals go in different directions, weakened and engaging with other animals that they wouldn't have engaged with before, and eventually with humans. So that whole process that is about global impacts to feed lots of people, meat mostly, uh, create the conditions uh, that allow for a market in Wuhan to all of a sudden you know, create this, or whether it's a chicken or a pig or a bat, time and time again, we see that in many ways, Maria, I think we forget because we're so awesome, right? Like we have airplanes and stuff like that, and rockets and little phones. We forget that we're biological beings, right? That we are part of that same ecosystem, that we literally evolved walking through those jungles, and that we're somehow disconnected from it. And here's a virus that can live in an animal, and it can live in this animal too. And I think that's the connection that we forget. But I interrupted you. You were talking first about clearly the virus did not come from carbon coming down from a cloud and impacting us. It literally happened through other processes, but there is a human connection to that. And as that happens, then what lessons to be learned about what to do and how to better prepare. I think clearly at a public health and from a perspective of epidemiology, but also from equity and systems and the economy and the worth we put in people. And I know that you have worked a lot with citizens in the developing world who we need to connect with more. There needs to be this sense of we are one planet and we're all impacting one another. I'm just wondering if you have any perspectives on that
Sure.
connection.
Yeah. No, you've made some really excellent points, and you also pointed out earlier that that these are unintended consequences. I think it's important in with COVID as well as with climate to not waste our time and energy laying blame, but on identifying the problem. So you've laid out really well what one of the problems is that actually creates has led to creating this virus and then the spread of the virus. But it also deforestation also leads to a lot of a lot of other problems with biodiversity. It takes the land away, living habitats for humans, but also for animals. But it also removes one of the carbon sinks that draws carbon out of the atmosphere. And the deforestation then leads to different forms of carbon emissions. But no one intended for that to be the cause of these great problems, or these greater crises. What I think is key for us to think about is that every solution comes from identification of a problem, right? So these issues that you point out, these are the same issues that scientists and researchers are now looking at and saying, okay, how do we avoid having this happen again? We don't want a recurrence. Or if it's an ongoing problem, how do we minimize or mitigate the consequences of this problem? And that's what we're, I think, all working on now in terms of COVID, but also in terms of crisis. Or the climate crisis. One of the things that I wanted to get to is what are the linkages between the pandemic and the global climate crisis that we might want to pay attention to, so that we can learn and respond better to both, to future potential pandemics, to the second wave of the COVID pandemic, which we've been told is a likely scenario in the near future, but also responding to climate change. And one of the key linkages is health. And it's a linkage that's very important, because it has to do with the well-being of humans living on the planet now, and also future generations. And so you mentioned air pollution. The air pollution that's caused from the emissions from diesel trucks, from energy production, from different forms of transportation, but also from the release of methane and other gases into the atmosphere. They don't only contribute to the greenhouse effect by creating this blanket over the planet that's heating up our atmosphere, but they also affect our respiratory systems, right? I read a fact the other day that shocked me when I was researching this topic, that there are 7 million deaths worldwide as a result of air pollution. 7 million deaths. That's annually. That's only a year. It's shocking. I mean, this is clearly a threat to human life, air pollution. And of course, it affects different countries and different areas in different ways. But many of us have been to cities where when you arrive, your eyes start watering, you cough, because the air contamination is so great. We also know that in the COVID pandemic, one of the more vulnerable groups to getting sick from the pandemic and getting severely ill are people who have respiratory difficulties or pre-existing conditions. So if we see both of those larger contexts, then we realize, wow, okay, this underlying situation of air pollution worldwide is making us more vulnerable to respiratory diseases, and especially to COVID and future pandemics, but it's also contributing to climate change. Well, that seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, the whole world should be focusing on that as a solution, because it addresses it addresses both of those areas, and then just the deaths from the respiratory diseases themselves. What I think what the health connection does is it helps us think about our vulnerability as human beings. You mentioned earlier, we humans, we oftentimes think we have superpowers and that we are invincible. And the fact is that we are not. but the greater fact is that there are parts of our world that are much less superhero like than others, right? There are parts of the world that are more vulnerable because of the inequities that exist due to poverty and other circumstances. That vulnerability is something that makes us human. I mean, I think we're all vulnerable in many aspects of our life, and sometimes vulnerability is a good thing, right? We don't to be completely superhuman is not the point. If we were indestructible as humans, we would probably be destroying our planet at an even faster rate. But when we identify this vulnerability, that our respiratory systems are fragile, and that the more fragile they are, the more exposed we are to even worse threats, then we can see, okay, where's the solution there? How do we protect ourselves? And by doing so, protect others and protect the planet. That vulnerability from from air pollution is one of the great, I think, opportunities that we are grasping in during this circumstance. And if we are able to solve that problem, or at least address it, we're going to create lots more benefits too, right? I mean, the healthier we are as a society, the less time we lose from work, right? The more able we are to do a lot of the activities that we want to do in our lives, the less we spend on healthcare. So there are a lot of economic benefits to addressing this underlying issue as well. So it's like lots of win-win. It's more than a win-win. It's lots of wins,
Sure,
and
sure.
to avoid the losses.
So I mean, you've been negotiating and working on issues, trying to find equity and trying to find solutions at the global level, with those countries and people you train and advise. Um, but the needle hasn't moved at the policy level in some nations, including my beloved nation. In fact, we're the only nation that walked out of the Paris talks. We have a nation that subsidizes the very fossil fuels that put those pollutants in the atmosphere, and we haven't invested enough in the solutions, the climate solutions, the clean energy that will help solve that problem. I know that you and the team that you work with um, to address the issue of ozone had different or interesting strategies that actually did move the needle and did impact not just protecting the ozone, but in so doing, addressing climate issues. I'm wondering if you could address two things. One, what lessons from your work in ozone can be applied to this pandemic as a way of really mobilizing the community out of something that was a palpable problem with a solution? And two, um, I think when it comes to this pandemic, the suffering of 7 million people impacted by pollution is something that we knew before the pandemic, this particular pandemic happened, but we still didn't act. What can we do at the societal level to make the invisible visible, as you're talking about, drawing connections between COVID-19, a respiratory disease caused by the coronavirus, and a polluted environment, so that there is action, so there's a sense of urgency, because now we've, as you said, I love the way you said that, you've identified a solution, so now you can solve it. So how do we make that connection stronger? And B, any lessons from your work with the ozone community?
Okay. Let's see if I can remember everything in the question. It was a beautiful question with many pieces, but I'll do my best. Yeah, the ozone treaty, the hole in the ozone layer that we have as a global community basically solved this problem, is a beautiful example. It's a great lesson that we can look to when we're solving other issues, not just environmental issues. But back in the 80s, scientists told us that we have a problem. Houston, we have a problem, and laid it out for us. we understood that the deterioration of the ozone layer as a result of many of the aerosols that we were using, as a result of probably people remember, we were told to stop using hairspray and other aerosols. As a result of the gases that go into refrigeration and into air conditionings, but also a number of different gases that were leading to this. And the world just got together and said, okay, we can solve this. Let's talk to the industries. Let's talk to the scientists. Let's get them together with researchers. Let's find solutions for this, and let's replace. We didn't have to sacrifice the lifestyles that we lived. We had to learn how to do things better, and that's part of what we really need to focus in on with the climate crisis. And interestingly, I mean, so many of the solutions are out there. I'm kind of a climate podcast junkie because I love listening to podcasts with experts and scientists and innovators from around the world talking about the solutions that they've already come up with. But you've pointed out a really important issue, which is that there's an obstacle. Somehow there's a big wall between our solutions, and the science. Well, let's begin with the science and the information we have from scientists, which is so important. I mean, listening to our scientists, taking them seriously, and using the information that they give us is absolutely critical. And that was a big part of solving the ozone problem. But then from the information that we've gotten from scientists, the world, many people in the world have come up with fantastic solutions that are not getting implemented. And they're not getting implemented for a number of reasons. And you've asked me, okay, so like how do we, what do we do in order to develop better, to live better on this planet? And one of the obstacles that we have is that our lawmakers, our rule makers, those who not only tell us, in a country what we should not do, but also they put in place instruments to guide us in certain directions. For example, subsidies, right, or tax incentives. If our politicians, if our lawmakers want to steer society in a certain direction, they can do that by incentivizing industries and individuals to behave in a certain way. And for 100 years, the world and many countries, not just ours, have been subsidizing fossil fuels, right? And that was important at a certain time. There was a time in our history when that industry needed the economic support in order to ensure that all of us as citizens were able to do the things we needed to do so that our country could develop, so that our economy could be strong. But that's no longer necessary. And so we need to turn to our rule makers, to our lawmakers, and get them the information that they need. But we also need to hear the voices of many, many more people. And the reason why I say that is because we all know that there are powerful, influencing companies, in particular in the private sector, that hold a lot of clout. They have a lot of power in our Congress and with our decision makers. And if we as citizens don't come together, we can't, our voice is not stronger than theirs when it comes to decision making. And so in order to tear down this wall between the solutions and implementing those solutions, it's not just a question of citizens going out and changing to hybrids or electric cars. That helps. I mean, by all means, do that if you can. But we need the solutions that happen at a broader scale, and they happen at the broadest scale when the policies are changed, right? And so with ozone, what we saw was, and this is a connection between the international decision-making bodies and our national day-to-day, is that all the countries of the world who are part of the Ozone Treaty got together. They said, okay, problem, solutions, let's map out how that will work. Developed countries, the wealthy countries, had to take measures first, and they agreed to do that because they have a lot of the technology, they have a lot of the money, and they also were using a lot of these products. They said, we'll take the lead, we'll do this first, and then we're going to help the developing countries to come in and do it second. And when that decision was made, every one of our countries went home, changed the laws as regarding the use of the chemicals and the substances that were creating the hole in the ozone layer. And within 30 years, we now see a major sort of recreation of the hole. Like it's a patching, it's a healing of the hole. It's not completely healed yet, but it's a healing. We're well on our way, and we know that we have solved that. The brilliant thing that we didn't intend to do was that in solving the ozone crisis, we actually did a lot for reducing the impacts of climate change, because those same gases that create the hole in the ozone layer, they're like super climate destroyers, right? They're so much more powerful than per ton than the same amount of carbon dioxide. And so by removing them, we've also saved a lot of time in terms of when the climate impacts are happening. And that's really one thing I want to point out whenever I talk to people. I say, we need more time to solve this climate problem. I mentioned to you, we have less than 10 years. The scientists told us a couple years ago that we had a 12-year time scale. Now it's less than 10 years to really put in place all of the systems that we need. And so that's why we hear a lot of our Congress people now talking about climate change. Some of them, very enthusiastically saying, okay, some of them talk about the Green New Deal. Others of them talk about ways to innovate in the energy sector. I mean, there's so many ways to do it. And in fact, because nearly everything that we do as human beings unfortunately contributes to climate change, we can look at it two ways. One, that it's a big problem with lots of pieces, but the other way to look at it is that it's a big problem with lots of solutions, right? So we can all be involved in a solution one way or another. I don't know if I answered all the questions
No,
there.
you did. And it's a matter of, look, the reason all the countries acted is because they saw a common threat to our existence. So they had to take action and respond. And they did, framed in the way that the folks at the Montreal Protocol, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Is where your work
Right.
was. So look, we need to understand that the pandemic, we know it's a pandemic that's global. The impact has been across the entire planet, and the consequences from human suffering, but also from the things that actually do move the needle too often, which is from an economic suffering. It's had incredible consequences. So my hope is that our policymakers, as you said, propelled by the community that demands action, can draw the connection between the threat that we face with the pandemic with the even bigger threat, one that will bring more infectious and more fatal pandemic in decades to come, along with sea level rise and all of the other consequences of this climate emergency, that they need to act to resolve that as a global community. And it is my hope that when this pandemic ends, this part of this pandemic ends, Ana Maria, that we do not go back to business as usual, and that we have new ways of thinking, new policy, new structures that will try to inoculate us just a little bit more so that we are less vulnerable than we are now. It has been so wonderful to talk to you and to
I just want to bring you made me think of one more thing
sure.
that a point that I really wanted to make that goes just to what you're talking about now, which is as we map out our solutions to this, and especially let's talk just about COVID, right? Right now, around the world, governments are trying to help their countries, because what we saw with COVID is this, a health crisis hit us. We weren't expecting it in any way. We had been warned that there might be pandemics, but we were not prepared, especially in this country. We were not prepared for a number of reasons that I'm not going to go into. But what we really want to make sure is that the solution is not worse than the problem, right? We really need to ensure that. And many people around the world and in our country are very worried because having to stay at home has led to a huge economic impact for them. And so we have to solve that now as well. Not only do we have to solve the virus crisis, but we also have to solve the economic impact that the only response that we had. We didn't have a choice. I mean, we don't. This is the only thing that we can do to keep the virus from spreading. But the negative impacts that it's had on people's lives are really significant. I mean, we all know how bad they are. So how do we turn that into gold, right? How do we also identify that problem and say what's the solution here? And with COVID, what's really interesting with the solutions that we have in terms of this economic stimulus that our country is putting in place to help people, is that we can also solve the climate problem, or at least parts of the climate problem, while we're solving the economic recession that we've gone into as a result of COVID. And I just wanted to point out a few things, right? So that we hear others, including some of our policymakers, talking about. So when we inject money into our economy in order to recover, we have to think about what can we do to reduce the vulnerabilities, right? So what we talked about in terms of health. How can we recover in a way that will also reduce air pollution, so that the next round of pandemic is not as hurtful to us as a society? How can we do it in a way that reduces our vulnerability to climate change, right? Can we put some of that money into renewables, moving away from coal and the dirty energy production that also affects our health? How can we do it in a way that that creates more jobs? And there are many job opportunities that also help with climate change, right? For example, planting mangroves, right? Or planting trees, or getting more involved in other types of climate preparation. I mean, in Florida, where you live, this is absolutely critical. We need a peaceful army of people out preparing the state for the impacts of the hurricanes that are to come, and those are jobs. So this is a way that we can address the economic crisis that we're living in now, and that is probable to, it's probable that it's going to get worse. But we have this money that the government is offering and strategizing to figure out, where to put it, who to help. Let's not help those who created the problem, right? Let's not help those who are deforesting our valuable, the lungs of our planet. Let's not help those who are contributing to the air pollution that has harmed our lungs. Let's help in a way that is smart, and we can do it in a smart way. I mean, we know how to do it. We just have to commit to doing it in that way. And that's where, we as citizens have to tell the people, our local and national decision makers, and we have to vote in that way too. We've got to put people in place who think in a way that's going to protect us and that's going to protect our children and all the future generations.
Thank you so much, Ana Maria. It's been so wonderful. Those pearls of wisdom, I hope they go far and wide. And thank you so much for the work you do day in and day out, pandemic or not.
My pleasure.
Appreciate all you do.
Pleasure to talk to you, Xavier, and good luck with your work as well. I'm rooting for you all the time.
All right. Stay safe, stay healthy.
Thank you. You too.